Hello and welcome to another episode of the Prism Pod. In today's episode, we're going to be discussing the science and art behind making the most of each meeting you have with a defence customer so that you get the most out of every engagement you ever have going forward. For those that don't know me, my name is Jack Cadman and I work across the defence ecosystem, advising and supporting defence suppliers from SMEs through to international primes on how defence actually decides, how momentum forms and how to ensure they achieve success within defence as fast as humanly possible. This episode is about why defence meetings quietly succeed or fail, and why the difference is almost never the technology, the offer, or the people in the room. By the end of this conversation, you will understand how defence actually experiences meetings, how it subconsciously assesses risk, credibility, and survivability, and why activity and enthusiasm so often masquerade as progress. We will unpack the non-negotiable laws that govern defence engagement, the different meeting modes required at each stage of the programme, and the specific behaviours that create momentum without triggering political, programme, or reputational exposure. If you have ever left a defence meeting feeling positive, only to be met with silence, this episode will give you a clear, repeatable framework for understanding why that happened and how to make the next one land very differently. We also cover how to respond to that silence. Like every episode, this one is built around a simple aim: to help organisations within defence engage with the customer in a way that makes future decisions feel safer, not louder. If you operate anywhere near defence, whether you are shaping early concepts, navigating live programmes, or supporting delivery through life, this is about understanding the system you are actually dealing with and learning how to move inside it without creating unintended risk. I want to start with something that looks simple on the surface, but is anything but once you sit with it. This happened over the course of a single defence convention I was at recently, in the same building within a matter of days. 2 meetings, same customer, same broad capability space, similar institutional context, and yet they landed very differently. One meeting felt open, candid, and genuinely constructive. The other felt flat, strangely unrewarding, and ultimately went nowhere. There were no dramatic failures, no doors slammed, no hostile feedback, just silence afterwards, and that silence is precisely why suppliers struggle to learn from it. What makes this worth unpacking is that, on paper, these meetings should have been indistinguishable. The technology was broadly similar, the offer did not materially change, the people in the room on the customer side didn't change, and the slides, if we were honest, were probably interchangeable. Everything was the same, and yet one interaction created momentum inside defence, while the other quietly stalled. The only meaningful difference was not what was discussed, but how the meeting was held, and specifically how much structure the conversation was operating under. In one meeting, the discussion was tightly framed. Purpose was explicit, the questions were disciplined, the pace was managed, and uncertainty was surfaced and contained rather than glossed over. The meeting had a clear shape to it, and as a result, defence engaged openly with the problem rather than defensively with the proposal. In the other meeting, the structure was looser and more familiar to a conventional industry-led pattern. Capability was presented, questions were answered competently, and time was filled efficiently. Nothing went wrong, but nothing was actively shaped either. The meeting progressed, but it did not converge. My position in those 2 meetings reflected that difference rather than caused it. In the first, I was closely involved in framing and steering the discussion as it unfolded. In the second, I was largely observing and contributing where appropriate, within a format that had already been set by the company that I was representing. That contrast turned out to be revealing, because it stripped away variables like technology, people, and intent, and left only the mechanics of the interaction itself. That contrast matters because it removes a lot of explanations suppliers often reach for. This was not about being a bad day, or the wrong audience, or defence being unreceptive. It was not about the capability, quality, team competence, or relationship warmth. It was about meeting architecture and behavioural control. It was about whether the interaction made defence feel safer or more exposed in the decisions that would follow once the exhibition hall had emptied and the real work resumed. Today, I want to unpack exactly why that difference mattered. Not as theory, not as motivational advice, and not as hindsight rationalisation, but as repeatable framework grounded in how defence actually decides, how it carries risk, and how it survives scrutiny long enough. That difference is not accidental, it's not luck, it's not chemistry, it is structural though. Defence meetings do not succeed or fail based on persuasion, charisma, or even technical merit. They succeed or fail based on whether the interaction makes defence feel safer or more exposed in the decisions that must follow. By the end of the episode, you should understand why most defence meetings feel busy but sometimes go nowhere, why silence after a meeting is never neutral, and how suppliers who truly understand this system create momentum without ever needing to sell. So before we talk tactics, formats, or clever phrasing, we need to be clear about the rules of the environment. Defence meetings operate under a set of non-negotiable laws, and these laws apply regardless of product, nationality, tier, or program maturity. You can ignore them, but you cannot bypass them. For each law, I'm going to give you an example of Company A and Company B. A represents what not to do, B represents what you should be doing. Rule 1. Defence is not buying capability, it is buying a safer future state. Every defence meeting, whether consciously or unconsciously, is assessed on a single question. Did this interaction make it easier or harder for defence to justify a decision later? Not whether the product is good, not whether people are impressive, and not whether the technology is advanced. Defence is not optimising for decision quality, it is optimising for decision survivability. And this distinction matters more than almost anything else suppliers need to understand. Inside defence, decisions are replayed years after they are taken, and they are replayed by auditors, by parliamentary committees, by ministers who were not in the room, and by people who are actively looking for failure. The question that dominates those later moments is not whether the outcome was good, but whether the decision was defensible. And that means it could be explained clearly, it could be shown that risks were understood, it could be shown that alternatives were considered, and that the logic could survive scrutiny by someone hostile or indifferent to the original intent. A decision that delivers good outcomes but cannot be defended later is treated as a bad decision. And that is not a moral judgment, it is a survival mechanism inside a system that has learned, through painful experience, that success does not protect you from blame. This is why so many suppliers are confused when they hear phrases like, "This is interesting," or "We like what you're doing," and yet nothing actually moves, because interest does not equal safety, and liking does not equal defensibility. If your presence in a meeting adds cognitive load, adds political exposure, or adds narrative complexity, you are net negative, regardless of how strong your capability is. Consider two suppliers briefing essentially the same capability into a land program at an early concept stage. Supplier A leads with performance and explains why their system outperforms the incumbent, how it closes an operational gap, and why delaying adoption will leave the force exposed. And the briefing is technically sound, the officers in the room nod, and someone even says, "Yes, that's exactly the gap we see." Supplier B starts somewhere entirely differently, acknowledges the operational gap is real, but immediately frames the problem as one of decision survivability, talks about how similar gaps in the past were addressed quickly, but later become politically difficult to defend when costs rose or integration issues emerged, and explicitly says whatever solution is chosen will need to survive scrutiny from people who were not present in the room. Both suppliers are right, only one reduces risk. From Defence's perspective, supplier A has just made their future harder, because if Defence moves quickly based on that briefing, they are now exposed to questions about why alternatives were not fully explored, why urgency was prioritised, and whether enthusiasm overtook discipline. Supplier B, by contrast, has just given Defence a narrative shield, and they have demonstrated that they understand not just the gap, but the future environment in which the decision will be judged. Even without advocating a solution, they have made Defence safer. Rule 2. Meetings are graded on behaviour under ambiguity. Defence already assumes that specifications will change, budgets will move, programs will stall, and politics will interfere. And these are not hypothetical risks, they are baseline operating conditions. Because of that, Defence is not looking for certainty, but it is looking for behaviour. And the real test is in any meeting is not how confident you sound when things are clear, it is how coherent you remain when the ground is not firm. What Defence is trying to read is whether that confidence collapses when uncertainty appears, and that means whether you acknowledge what you do not yet know, whether you sit comfortable with ambiguity without rushing to reassurance, and whether you describe uncertainty as something to be managed, sequenced or bounded, rather than eliminated by assertion. Suppliers who rush to certainty signal fragility. Suppliers who can calmly sit inside uncertainty signal nothing but authority. Imagine one meeting where a senior Defence official asks a supplier a seemingly simple question. How confident are you that this delivery timeline is realistic? Supplier A answers immediately. They say they're very confident, they cite internal planning, prior programs, and contingency margins. The answer is smooth, fast, reassuring. Supplier B pauses, acknowledges that parts of the timeline are well understood, but others depend on decisions not yet taken, particularly around integration and assurance, and explains which elements are within their control, which are shared risks, and which would only crystallize later, without rushing to reassure. Defence hears something very different in these two answers. Supplier A has removed ambiguity, verbally, but not structurally, so Defence now carries the risk if that confidence later proves misplaced. Supplier B, on the other hand, has kept ambiguity visible, but governable, and they have shown how uncertainty behaves over time. Rule 3. Momentum matters more than enthusiasm. A good defence meeting does not feel exciting. It feels directional. Defence trusts suppliers who narrow options rather than expand them, who make future conversations easier rather than richer, and who leave behind language that can be reused internally without distortion. This leads to a critical distinction that many suppliers miss. Movement is not progress. Defence activity increases when risk is unresolved. Meetings multiply, workshops appear, requests for information expand, trials are commissioned, and none of this necessarily indicates advancement. Progress only occurs when risk is reduced, bounded, or transferred. Suppliers who mistake activity for advancement could inevitably stall. To bring this to life, imagine a program team holds a series of industry engagements and one supplier is always available, proposing workshops, white papers, trials, and joint working groups. Their energy is relentless and defence activity around them increases noticeably. Another supplier is far quieter, speaks less, responds selectively, and when they do engage, they summarise discussions into tight framings that defence can reuse internally. 6 months later, the programme has moved forward, but the first supplier is no longer in the conversation. Because, from Defence's point of view, the first supplier created motion without reducing risk, while the second supplier reduced the number of conversations Defence needed to have. Defence does not reward effort, it rewards reduction in internal work. Rule 4. Silence is not neutral, it is diagnostic. When Defence goes quiet after a meeting, one of three things has happened. You either made the decision safer and they're working internally, you added risk and they are disengaging, or you were interesting but unfortunately irrelevant. Silence is data. It is not rudeness, it is not avoidance, it is a signal. Your entire engagement strategy must optimise for the first outcome only. Imagine a supplier delivers what they believe is an excellent briefing. Defence thanks them, says it was useful, but then goes quiet. Supplier A responds by chasing with follow-ups, offers clarifications, and asks if there's anything else they can provide. Each message is polite, professional, and well-intentioned. Supplier B, though, doesn't chase. It waits, and 2 weeks later sends a single, summarising note with one insight from the meeting and how it might be framed internally, explicitly stating that no response is required unless useful. Defence is more likely to re-engage Supplier B because Supplier A has increased cognitive load at exactly the wrong moment, while Supplier B respected the internal process and made it easier. Rule 5. Every Defence meeting is also a political containment exercise. Defence does not decide in isolation. Every programme sits inside ministerial pressure, cross-government scrutiny, audit exposure, and institutional memory of past failure. Suppliers are judged not only on what they offer, but on whether they help Defence manage those pressures without creating new ones. A technically credible meeting that increases political exposure is still a failed meeting. If your narrative forces Defence to explain something more complicated than before, or exposes them to a line of question they cannot yet safely answer, you have increased risk, you haven't reduced it. To bring that to life, imagine a supplier briefing a sovereign capability leans heavily into national resilience, jobs, and industrial strategy, and the narrative aligns strongly with political messaging. Defence listens, but it becomes guarded. Another supplier touches the same themes, but explicitly acknowledges the political sensitivity, says they are conscious these arguments can create scrutiny if used prematurely, and that any industrial narrative will need to be sequenced carefully to avoid driving cost concerns too early. This causes Defence to relax. Both suppliers are politically aware, but only one demonstrates they can help Defence manage political exposure rather than amplifying it. Rule number 6. Every Defence meeting has a cognitive load constraint. Decision makers in Defence operate under severe cognitive constraint, and every meeting has a finite tolerance for complexity, novelty, and conditional logic. When that budget is exceeded, Defence does not ask for clarification. It disengages, defers, or defaults to familiar options. Most suppliers lose not because they are wrong, but because they explain too much. And the ability to say less while still reducing risk is one of the rarest and most valuable skills in Defence engagement. To illustrate this, imagine a technical team brings an expert who knows the system intimately and answers every question in depth. certain edge cases, secondary effects, and hypothetical future upgrades. Defence thanks them, but later describes that meeting as heavy. By contrast, another supplier answers fewer questions, frames answers around decision relevance, and explicitly says when detail is available but unnecessary at this stage. Defence leaves clearer in the second meeting than the first. The difference is not intelligence, it is discipline of information. So how does this look at different stages of a program when you're engaging with defence? One of the most common reasons suppliers fail in defence is that they use the same meeting behaviour everywhere and at every stage, treating every interaction as if it exists on a single continuum of selling, rather than recognising that defence operates in distinct engagement contexts with fundamentally different needs at each stage. There are 4 of these stages, and each require a different operating mode from the supplier. The first phase is pre-program or pre-concept. In this phase, there is no funded program. The problem is not fully articulated, internal disagreement exists, and political cover is thin. Defence does not need solutions here. It needs help thinking, and the supplier role at this stage is sense maker, shaping how the problem is understood rather than advocating a particular answer. Winning behaviour involves asking better questions than defence is asking itself, naming constraints that are felt but not yet articulated, and providing analogies from other programs without pushing towards commitment. The objective of the meeting is that defence leaves able to describe the problem more clearly than before. To compare the 2 approaches, imagine a supplier is invited to an exploratory discussion about a future capability area where there is no program and no funding. Supplier A brings slides showing readiness, maturity, and timelines. Supplier B asks where defence feels stuck, what assumptions are being carried forward by default, and what constraints feel structural rather than accidental. Defence is more likely to leave Supplier B's meeting with new language to describe the problem, while Supplier A is remembered as probably keen. Only one of those descriptions leads anywhere. The second phase, concept definition and risk reduction. This is where programs have a direction of travel which exists, a business case which is being written, but political scrutiny is increasing and risk ownership is forming. Defence needs confidence without commitment, of evidence of delivery credibility without being forced into decision, and a partner rather than a vendor. The supplier role here is risk converter, turning unknowns into bounded risks. Winning behaviour involves explicitly acknowledging uncertainty, showing how uncertainty can be managed or deferred, and translating experience into governance-safe language. The meeting objective is making the next internal defence step feel survivable. So imagine a hypothetical scenario, which is an early business case phase. Defence expressed concerns about affordability and long-term supportability. Supplier A argues their system is cost-effective and points to economies of scale, particularly through export. Supplier B agrees affordability is the core risk, then separates delivery affordability from narrative affordability, explaining that exports can stabilise demand later, but using exports to justify early cost will trigger scrutiny, and offers to help defence frame exports as optional upside rather than foundational logic. Defence does not decide anything that day, but the language that Supplier B has used is more likely to appear in internal papers, and that is momentum being created right there. The third phase, which is live program or competitive phase. Here, the formal process is underway. Legal exposure is high, fairness and auditability dominate, and informal shaping becomes dangerous. Defence needs predictability, clean evaluation criteria, and minimal controversy. A supplier role is low-risk option. Winning behaviour is disciplined, minimalist, and internally aligned. And the meeting objective is simple. Do nothing that could be used against the program later. So in the live competitive phase, imagine a supplier tries to be helpful by offering insight into how evaluation criteria could be interpreted, and defence becomes uncomfortable. On the other hand, another supplier asks where the boundaries of discussion sit and explicitly states their intent to remain within them. Defence then relaxes, because helpfulness that introduces ambiguity is risk, while predictability is safety. The final phase is through life and strategic partnering. After a decision, trust is fragile. Early delivery defines reputation, political interest increases again, and at this stage, defence is judging organisational behaviour as much as capability. The supplier role becomes the institutional stabiliser, and winning behaviour includes transparency about bad news, early signalling of constraints, and visible investment in people and systems, with the objective being to demonstrate the relationship to reduce future headaches. In this example, a supplier encounters an early delivery issue. Supplier A delays disclosure while they work on a fix. Supplier B flags the issue early, explains implications, and outlines options. Defence will more likely forgive Supplier B than Supplier A, because transparency is not about ethics, it is about reducing future shock. So how do we structure the meeting across all different phases? Across all of these contexts, successful defense meetings follow the same underlying architecture, and the emphasis and tone change by program stage, but the structure does not. What I'm going to do now is run this as a live walkthrough, because suppliers do not fail on knowing the labels, they fail on what it looks like minute by minute in the room, and they fail on what defense is experienced internally as each stage unfolds. So stage 1 of any meeting is authority framing. The first 2 minutes of a defense meeting matter more than most suppliers realize, because this is when defense decides whether this interaction is safe, bounded, and governable, or whether it is about to become another uncontrolled narrative they later have to manage. Authority framing is not credentials, it is intent and boundaries, and you explicitly set why the meeting exists, what it is not for, and what useful looks like today. So in the example, the supplier opens calmly and says that the purpose of the session is to sense check where defense is, understand what is forming in the business case, and identify 2 or 3 areas where industry input can reduce risk. The supplier says explicitly they are not trying to force decisions, that there are questions defense may not be able to answer, which is fine, and that the goal is for defense to leave with language and structure they can reuse internally without supplier being present. The supplier then pauses and looks for acknowledgement, not because they're seeking permission, but because they're establishing mutual intent and reducing ambiguity. What defense experiences internally in that moment is relief, because the meeting has boundaries and it is not a trap, and they do not need to defend themselves, commit or perform because they've agreed to all the boundaries. That relief is not a soft emotion. It is a decision enabler, because when defense feels safe, defense speaks. So, stage 2, when defense speaks first. Defense must speak meaningfully within the first 5 minutes, and your role is to prompt rather than feel silence. Questions like, where are you right now in one sentence? Or what decision are you trying to make safer over the next 3 months? Are not icebreakers, they're diagnostic tools. If defense has not spoken early, the meeting is already drifting, either because defense does not feel safe or because you have signaled this is performance rather than thinking. So in the hypothetical scenario, the supplier asks one tight question in this stage. If you had to describe where you are right now in one sentence, what is the real work of the next 3 months? And then they stop talking. Defense will often respond with a mixture of program status and constraint exposure. The supplier lets them run because the point is not to get a short answer. The point is to hear how defense frames the world, what risks are live, what narratives are forming, and what is being avoided. As defense speaks, the supplier takes notes, not in a performative way, but in a way that signals this matters and I'm treating your constraints as real. What defense experiences internally is that they are being listened to as decision makers under pressure, rather than treated as procurement gatekeepers, which shifts posture immediately. After this goes into constraint validation. Before you analyze anything, you legitimize defense's reality, and you explicitly acknowledge political pressure, affordability constraints, reputational risk, and institutional scar tissue. You do not solve them at this point, you demonstrate understanding without judgment, because constraint validation creates psychological safety and unlocks candor, and without it, defense stays guarded, regardless of how open the conversation appears. So after defense outlines where they are, the supplier reflects back in a single paragraph that it sounds like the business case is being written under affordability tension, under scrutiny that will increase as soon as narrative moves beyond the program team, and with reputational exposure, because early delivery and user belief will define whether the program becomes politically survivable. The supplier does not editorialize, does not blame, and does not posture. They simply name the reality the customer's feeling. They might even say, that all makes sense and is exactly the combination that causes programs to drift if the narrative is not bounded early. What defense experiences internally is that the supplier has named the unspoken without making it uncomfortable, which means defense can now talk about the real problem rather than the polite version of it. So then stage 3, that is constraint mapping. Only after validation do you map constraints, and you reflect back tensions and trade-offs and then add insight. You're not trying to say, here is what we do. You are saying, here is how this type of problem usually behaves. This positions you as a sense maker rather than a vendor, and it reduces defense's cognitive load because you are doing the structuring work in the room. So in the example, the supplier now takes what defense said and converts it into a clean map. So they might say, I'm hearing 4 constraint fields that will govern whether this remains survivable. Affordability as both real budget and narrative comfort. Number 2, delivery credibility as behaviour under constraint rather than factory scale. Number 3, interoperability as a timing problem rather than a binary choice. And 4, reputation as user belief before fielding, not after. They then explain briefly but correctly, how each of these constraints tend to behave over time and where the failure modes usually surface. And they do it without flooding the room with detail. If it is relevant, they might introduce one discipline distinction that defense can lift later, such as delivery risk versus governance risk or cost reality versus cost narrative, because those distinctions become reusable internal language. What defense experiences internally is recognition and containment, because complexity has been organized into something that can be carried and explained without the supplier present. So stage 4 is made up of 2 parts: evidence as reassurance and decision ownership capture. Firstly, evidence is introduced to calm, anchor, and bound risk, but not to impress. If evidence cannot be repeated internally without you present, it is nothing but noise. A common failure mode here is capability flooding, overwhelming defense with technically impressive but decision irrelevant detail that increases cognitive load and perceived risk. In our hypothetical meeting, the supplier introduces only evidence that reduces a specific anxiety defense already expressed, and they frame it as, "This is not proof you should choose us, it is proof that this risk can be bounded in a way that survives scrutiny." They might reference prior programs and explicitly map which aspects are analogous and which are not, because defense trusts suppliers who can limit their own analogy rather than overextend it. If the evidence is technical, the supplier ties it to governance, such as how test artifacts can be reused, how reassurance logic can be structured for audit, how behaviour under duty cycle or sustainment realities were evidence rather than asserted, and they stop as soon as the evidence has done its job. What defense experiences internally here is calm rather than overwhelm, because the evidence has reduced uncertainty rather than added information. This then goes into the decision ownership capture I mentioned. This is where many good meetings leak value. When defense agrees with an insight, do not move on initially. Explicitly ask to carry part of the load and offer to capture the logic in decision-safe language or take first pass at articulation. This is the translation from helpful partner to decision co-author. Without this step, insight lands, but ownership leaks. So imagine defense nodding at a framing, perhaps on how exports should be positioned, and the supplier pauses and says, "If that's a fair characterization, would it help if we captured it in a form you can use internally?" A short paragraph that answers all of the challenges without naming markets prematurely and is defensible under scrutiny. They then add, "We can take first pass at this and bring it back for reaction, not decision." This is not selling, it is workload relief, and it is governance aware, because it explicitly frames the output as reactable and bounded. What defense experiences internally in this moment is relief, because someone has offered to carry the hardest thinking and translation work. And that is what defense teams are drowning in at this stage and most stages. Finally, the last stage, stage 5, decision, save, close. You never end with "we'll follow up" or "let us know." You end with a clear fork, a named owner, and an explanation of how the step reduces risk, because momentum is created here or not at all. Imagine the supplier closes by summarizing 3 outputs they will return with, each explicitly tied to risk reduction, and they name who it will go to and what it is for. They might say, based on today, we will come back with 1 page on X, a discipline narrative on Y, and a proposed structure of Z for our future engagement. We'll bring those back for your reaction, so you can either use them, adjust them, or discard them. What defense feels is clarity without pressure in that moment, and reduced workload, because the meeting has produced a survivable next step that does not require defense to invent it later. So what I want to close on are a couple of things. Firstly, the behaviour signals defense is actually reading. Defense is always reading behaviour, even when silent, and it is scoring internal coherence, relationship to power, treatment of uncertainty, narrative discipline, reusable decision language, and risk ownership posture. Misalignment inside your team is treated as future delivery risk. Flattery and excessive deference undermine confidence. Rushed certainty signals fragility, and narratives that cannot survive retelling die inside the institution. Perhaps most importantly, defense is always asking who carries the risk if this goes wrong, and they are watching whether you push risk onto defense or absorb some of it, whether you wait to be asked or volunteer to carry the hardest thinking, and whether you frame uncertainty as your problem or our shared exposure. Suppliers who visibly carry risk are trusted faster because they are lowering institutional anxiety in the only currency that matters inside defense, which is future defensibility. The suppliers who win in defense are not the ones with the best answers. They're the ones who ask the questions defense is afraid to formalise, behave in a way that lowers institutional anxiety, and make future decisions feel less dangerous. If defense leaves a meeting calmer than when it entered, you did well. And if it leaves impressed but not uneasy, you did not. And everything else is secondary.